Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well during this rather challenging time for all of us. Um, Here, I'm Danush, and I lead our business development efforts here at Explain. I work with clients to understand their needs and make sure that our teams deliver innovative solutions that meet those needs. All right, Greg, if you can, thank you. So we are Explain. We are a design consultancy, and we combine the left brain strategic expertise of a management consulting firm with the right brain creative power of a design studio. And we drive positive change in the world. That's our purpose. That's our mission. And Greg, if we can go to the next slide. Um, and here in San Francisco, we are in week 7 of lockdown, which feels like an awfully long time for someone who's used to being on planes a lot. This is the longest time I've had my bare feet on the same floor ever. How are you doing, Greg?
Yeah, I'm the same. It's navigating working from home is both with a luxury in one hand and a difficulty on the other.
So yes, we do recognize that while many of us are fortunate to be safe and to be working, this new normal that we're all kind of getting used to or adapting to is hard. Next slide, please, Greg. At least for me personally, the separation between work and life has completely collapsed, and there's a pretty strong chance that in the next, over the course of the next hour that we're together, you might see my 4-year-old climbing these shelves over here, and I've become intimately familiar with my clients' pets and kids and spouses, and so in some ways it's bringing the humanity back, but it is shifting how we work. And at Explain, a lot of the work that we do is helping organizations transform. And we know that it's not organizations that change, but it's the people inside them that do. And one of the frameworks that we use in our work is this one right here called the 8 dimensions of the organization. And basically the way we look at it is we think of organizations as holistic systems, and for the system to work effectively, all these 8 dimensions sit in balance, and so if you start to change one of them, the whole system gets thrown out of balance, and you need to rebalance all the pieces. So for example, if the ways in which we are working change, if our behaviors at work change, likely that's going to affect the culture, the values, maybe even the processes, and so on and so forth. And so for an organization to function effectively, these pieces need to all be redesigned and brought back into balance. And that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. So what we'll talk about today is identifying what culture is and how you can build it. We'll also cover how you can design the behaviors that then drive the outcomes that you want to achieve. And as we do that, we'll recognize the enablers that will help your organization evolve toward this new normal, whatever that ends up being. Over to you, Greg.
Okay, well, thanks again, everyone, for joining us. A lot of what we're going to talk about today, and we'll try to make this early part brief and kind of get to the meat of what we want to share, but it really has a lot to do, obviously, with, it's part of the title of what we're talking about today. It's the culture of an organization. The ways that organizations are built go way beyond the roles we have, the responsibilities we have, the people that we report to, the people who report to us. How we operate together is tied completely into the series of beliefs, there's assumptions, there's values for the organization and for the people within it. There's the ways that we interact. All of these sort of contribute to a unique social and psychological environment in any organization. And it's often hard to pin down exactly what that means or what it looks like or what it is. It's sort of the classic, I'll know it when I see it. I'll know a good culture when I see it. And what we're trying to do today is figure out how can we begin to pull that culture apart into some discrete pieces so that people can literally understand these are the building blocks of our organization's culture. And if there's something that we want to shift within that, how might we go about that? Obviously, the reason that this is important right now is because all of us are, because of the way that I'm talking to you now through this medium rather than sitting with you in a room, and my coworkers are in San Francisco and elsewhere in Portland or in New York or Geneva for that matter. The ways in which we interact have changed dramatically. And so that means that the ways that our organization interacts is going to change dramatically. So how can we begin to pay attention to that in order to make this new way that we're interacting work better? Or how can we use this time to think about how we might design things when we get back to that potential new future? You know, and we're all not quite sure what that new future looks like, but we can at least start to give some thought to how we want to organize when our organizations can come back together. Okay. So I have a poll real quick that I want to ask you to respond to. You should see up on your screen right now. So which of these kind of issues do you think are most concerning you? What brought you here today? Are you concerned with figuring out how to replicate the culture from your classic office now that you're in a virtual world? Or perhaps things are going really, really well in a distributed environment like this, and you want to figure out how to continue that in the future. Also, there's the idea of, you know, regardless of where we work, how can we begin to identify the things that kind of hold us back so that we can articulate them to the point we can make decisions around how to get around them. And as I'm looking at the polling numbers coming in here, it looks like it's far greater at the last of those three than anything else. To some degree, that makes sense. Any of us want to be sure that we can pay attention to, or at least have the ability to pinpoint how we can make some positive shifts in the way that we work. So I'm gonna end that poll right now. I think that's pretty clear, over 75% for the last one. So let's just quickly share the results. Far and away, that last one. Very interesting. So let's get to work then. Let's get rid of that. Ultimately, our point today is that culture doesn't just happen. It's something that we can actually have some control over. We can make some decisions about it and we can design it. And how that sort of can be helpful seems like it would be understandable, right? If we want to grow the organization, we have to figure out how to scale the culture. If our culture is going sideways, at least we can have some time to really pinpoint how we might make steps to address that and really fix that. So that's all about what culture mapping is. And that's really specifically what we're talking about today, is how to map your culture. This is a tool that we've been using for a couple of years. I'll give you just a kind of a little bit of background on it. I won't take too much time here, but Dave Gray, the founder of Explain, and Alex Osterwalder, who's the founder of Strategizer, who you might know from the Business Model Canvas and other canvases, they worked together a couple of years ago to figure out how can we actually figure out a way to map a culture. And they lean very, very heavily on some classic organizational development theory by the two men on the bottom here, Chris Argyris from Harvard Business School and Edgar Schein from the Sloan School at MIT. Just very quickly, the kinds of things that they were paying attention to were, you know, Schein put forth this idea that what you see in an organization is really kind of the tip of the iceberg. The outcomes that happen in any kind of organization, the ways that we behave, that's all really affected by all these things that are not necessarily routinely seen, or sometimes just sort of taken for granted, like assumptions we make about the ways that we will work together, or the values that we have when we come together. They may not be explicitly stated, but they all have an effect on how we do the work and what comes out of it. And the second piece of this that Argyris kind of put forward was really this idea about often we'll say we're acting one way in a particular theory, but we're doing it in a different way. And we see this a lot in change scenarios when teams get stuck moving from one thing to another. It's like we say we're going to act in this new way, but what we actually do is kind of act in the old way. We're just saying that it's something new. So having all of that in play, Dave and Alex decided, how can we like create a simple framework that can help people pull these things apart and kind of make some decisions about what they can do? And that's kind of what led to the culture map tool. So let me share this with you for a few minutes. It's for people who have experience using different kinds of canvases. This probably isn't going to be very unusual. When you first look at it, it looks relatively simple, and it does just break down a couple of things that the iceberg illustration a moment ago kind of shared. Let me sort of walk through how we tend to think about this. The first thing that we'll look at when we're working with a team or asking or just explaining how this tool works really is all around behaviors. It's getting people to really identify what they see happening in their organizations, how they themselves are behaving, what that feels like, what they are witnessing, whether for people on their teams or outside of their teams. How would they describe the activity within their organizations? Literally, how do we show up? How do we work? What do we do together? And that always will lead to the outcomes, right? In modern business, this is classically counted around hours or dollars or impact. These are the things that you can witness that come out of our work at the end. These are often the deliverables or the goals that we're shooting for. But the most important part of this canvas is really the bottom piece. And this is what we just sort of generically call the enablers and blockers. Because there's things that make it easy for us to do work in our culture, and there's things that make it harder for us to do work in our culture. And some of these are very specific, and they're documented. They're processes in organizations. Sometimes those really work. Sometimes they're sort of old and outdated, and they kind of hold us back. We need to change them. But there's also a lot of unwritten rules in organizations, unwritten ideas that people share, like, well, the best way to do this in this organization is to do X rather than Y, like they tell you to when you onboard. I mean, there's always things like workarounds like that, or sort of back channel discussions in organizations. Sometimes those can be really helpful, just understanding the information, how it works in an organization. But sometimes it can be hard, and it can get in the way. So what we want to do now is kind of walk through this tool a little bit with an example. We're just going to create a fictional company here. We're going to call it Acme Capital. And Acme is a relatively traditional company. They've been doing very, very face-to-face based work there for the entirety of their history. When this crisis happened, they even struggled to figure out how to work remotely because they still worked primarily on desktop units and their computers. They really didn't even have laptops. So that was the first thing that they had to do, was figure out how were we going to work in a distributed way really quickly, okay? So what we want to do is just a quick example using this tool. And let's have them define how they worked in March and what they would like to be doing when they kind of can come back together, hopefully in June. So let's use the tool and walk through that. So like I showed a while ago, whenever we use this canvas, and how I would really encourage you to use it, is always to start with the behaviors, because those are the things that are the easiest to get your head around, that you can witness very, very quickly. In Acme's case, clearly you can see here, there's some things that were holding them back from moving them forward even then, right? There's a lot of sort of behaving the way we always have around here. There's a lot of sort of protecting our own turf. If something changes and we don't necessarily know why it's changing, nobody sort of filled us in on that, well, I'm going to tend to kind of circle in around how I do my work anyway, and just kind of hope that blows over. And that has all kinds of effects on organizations. what the outcomes that were happening for Acme really were very specific around not delivering what they said they were going to deliver. Projects were late. People were making mistakes. Decisions were made on information that was poor because information wasn't shared very readily. They didn't have everything that they needed. People were confused. This is a kind of a culture where often there's a lot of frustration, right? And they're not moving very quickly because the process of how they share information or how they collaborate is really not well defined at all. And so somebody within this organization who's trying to figure out, well, how do I make some kind of a change here when all I'm seeing is these sort of mistakes and problems and lower profits that we're getting in trouble for? Well, the next question that we want you to ask if you're facing a situation like this, like the people at Acme, is what is it that puts us there? How do these things happen? What enables these things to happen, or what keeps the good parts of our organization from coming forward? Sometimes it's just very straightforward, like, well, we don't really have any consequences for bad behavior here. There may be some supervisors who don't necessarily have a very human-centered or employee-centered way of helping people along. Maybe it's because they weren't trained very well. They were sort of put into a place it's because they had been there for a while, and maybe it's felt like it was, well, it's Greg's turn to take that role. And so often this, again, there's a snowfall, there's a waterfall that you can see here. It's a lack of processes. There's, well, I'm thinking to belabor this. It's an easy way to see how an organization could go sideways. So in Acme's case, as they've moved into this kind of our current world of working remotely, of working from home, of trying to figure out how to collaborate together, these things become pain points immediately. People who are trying to go through a particular process around, say, how they engage a particular client company with their new offerings in a 401k plan, for example. That there is no process here for how they can share that information to the right people within Acme to share to the clients. It's done on a very ad hoc, handed from desk to desk kind of way. And so this is immediately a pain. There are clients who need information, who want information, and they can't get it because Acme literally doesn't know how to deliver that. So someone within Acme who's trying to figure out, okay, how might we do this better? Maybe they can start to plan this in a slightly different way. And so this is how you can do this as well in your own organization. So let's do a second column here of what we might like June to be like, okay? So what are the behaviors that we would like to see at Acme? The people at Acme would like to see at Acme, right? They want to hear people saying, oh, actually, I've done that. I can show you how to do it. That's the sign of someone literally collaborating, leaning across a silo, saying, I know this is new. I know that we haven't had a lot of experience with this yet, but I have, and I'm happy to show you how that works. That's the kind of on the ground kind of collaboration that's going to help organizations really start to knit things together in a hurry. If they're still working in a kind of a hybrid way, which I expect many organizations will, sort of like we are right now through Zoom, their cameras are on. They're actually seeing one another within the screen, and they're making connections that are as close as they can get to being in person. I think we've all experienced these kind of situations where everyone's camera is off and all you're seeing is either a black screen with somebody's name or an avatar, or in my case, it's a funny picture of me singing karaoke. But that's not very personal. Being able to see somebody through the lens, see our physical features moving, talking, it's a way to make a connection it's not perfect, but it's a whole lot better than nothing. And it really can help as teams begin to think about how they're working together because they can see one another. Oh, my favorite part of this one is maybe meetings don't last quite as long. Maybe we're more focused. Maybe the things are so clear and things are going so much better that we're getting things done. So the outcomes from this, in this new world, what we're plotting for Acme, maybe things are getting done faster, and that means that we're saving on budget, which means we're making a higher margin. Maybe some of our customers are actually coming back to us to do additional work rather than the kind of one and done things because the experience wasn't really that good before. People who were griping a lot about not wanting to be here, now that they're seeing ways that we are operating better and together, maybe they're staying, maybe they're even talking about staying, seeing what the future can hold. And if things are going so well in this kind of hybrid way, maybe even there's a little bit of budget suddenly that you can personalize a home office. If you're going to be working from home occasionally, like we are now, maybe there's a way that the company can actually support that. And they might have some budget to if things are going better. Now, obviously, this stuff right here is things that we want to plot for the future, right? These are things that Acme is putting forward and saying, this is what we want to see. So here's the most important part of this. What are the things that have to be in place in order to enable those behaviors and to keep those blocking behaviors from showing up in an organization again? How do we have to think about this? Some of the things we can do is suddenly maybe we'll see an open door, or I'm putting that in quotes because maybe it's an open Zoom policy in a hybrid environment. Maybe you can reach directly to a supervisor or a manager rather than kind of holding things in and just sort of not understanding how to make some decisions within your group, or this sort of backbiting that happens sometimes, the griping that really doesn't get us anywhere. Maybe we can reach directly to that person now in a way we couldn't before. Maybe because we are forced to use these new tools like we're using right now, maybe the company could actually put some investment into showing you the best ways to use them. Here at Explain, we use a tool often. And even more frequently now, it's an online whiteboarding tool. It's called Mural. It's extremely flexible and very helpful for us in sort of replicating some of our in-person sessions. But it takes a little getting used to, and it takes a little bit of training at the beginning of each of our sessions to show people how to use them. I know of other companies who are using a similar tool within their organizations to do internal brainstorming or plotting projects as they go forward. So not only using these new tools, but taking the time to sort of document them and show how we use them and how it can really help us move forward on certain projects can really be helpful. And maybe even the most clear thing we can put in here is, in this new way of work, there are things that will change that we have to, that we obviously can't help. Before, in the proverbial before time, when organizations were very used to working together, there are a lot of rituals or behaviors that would kind of spring up that we ended up depending a lot on and maybe didn't realize it until we didn't have those anymore. And so Acme, like a lot of companies, could maybe be paying some attention to what are those rituals that happen that connected our people, or what are the things that we could create that can make our people feel more connected. So when we do get into a place where we need to collaborate better on a project, we have a little better understanding or relationship with the people that we're working with. We've created more of a commitment to our organization and to the work that we're doing, and sometimes to one another. And that can help go a long way in not only making a day-to-day work environment better, but delivering better outcomes and creating that kind of culture that we really want in the future. So I know that this is a relatively simplistic example that we've used here with this fictional company. And we've just created things that we've put up here. But these aren't far off from how a lot of things that a lot of organizations experience. And so when you think about this tool, when you think about how is it that we can begin to plan around those things that send us sideways, right? Those blockers of our behaviors. Think about how to break that culture apart by using this tool. Really focus first on thinking about the behaviors that you can see, what's really concrete, the tangible things you can see in every day, the ways that we operate, whether that's through a Zoom environment or GoToMeeting or WebEx or whatever you're using, or if you're in a physical office. What are the things that we're witnessing? And what are the outcomes that behavior leads to? Those are things that we're held accountable for to our superiors, our supervisors, our managers. Getting those out in the open and then having a really hard look collaboratively with a team. Have those hard conversations, have those open, hard conversations around what is it about our culture that lets these things happen? What is it we can pay attention to that we may need to shift? And maybe even what can we build in the future that we don't have now that can help us make these advances? It looks like a very, as I said at the beginning, looks like a very straightforward, very simple canvas, but it's very flexible. And you can use it at a team level, you can use it at an organizational level, you can even use it on a project level or a tiger team level. Anytime that there's some formulation of an organization coming together, or people coming together to try to achieve something, this can be a helpful way to pull those actions and behaviors apart, be able to identify them and make some decisions about the things that you don't want to do and the things that you do want to do in order to behave better. And I'm going to ask Danush to walk through something that we've kind of taken our own medicine here at Explain.
Thank you, Greg. So yeah, one of the things that we routinely did at Explain was we would have meals together. And this was a very important part of our culture, and we didn't realize it. It was something that happened so organically. We didn't realize it until it was completely gone, right? With everyone sheltered, we didn't have the chance to dine together. And this would happen in many different ways. Greg and I would very often share cocktails after a client session, and that's when we would, start to bounce ideas around about what we heard and how we can solve this, and that's where the creative sparks would start to flow. It was the same thing in our office. Like, many of us would be on the road, but we would love those opportunities when we could come back to the office. Once every week or two, or more often than that for some, and we'd gather and we'd have lunch together, and again, within the chit chat of catching up on life and work, a lot of great ideas would start to evolve. And when all that suddenly went away, we realized we really missed that, and it was affecting the work as well. And so, we identified that the behavior that we were engaging in was dining together. The outcome of that was the creative solutions that, as a team, we were able to come up with. And what we found the enablers to being was the fact that we could, gather around a table, and in that informal setting, let some ideas flow, and it wasn't precious, and there was no judgment and things like that. And so those were the enablers. And then we realized the blocker was when you didn't have that body language, when you didn't have that informal camaraderie. And so we tried to recreate that. And so one of our team members said, okay, well, I miss hanging out with you guys. So let's do lunch on Tuesdays. And so they set up a lunch meeting on Tuesdays. It was an open Zoom invite, and anyone that wanted to join could join. And the first one was a little bit bumpy, right? Like, we realized all the micro dynamics started to flare up. Zoom, when you're on Zoom, you can only really talk one person at a time, or it gets very chaotic. That's quite different than dining at a table together. The second thing that we noticed was we're collapsing 3D down to 2D, right? And so we had to gesture more, and then things like that to communicate the body language that had gone away. But we did through a few trial and errors, we realized that, okay, just 8-10 people showing up to a Zoom call with no topic was just dead silence. And so we over a few iterations of this, what we realized was, okay, if we have a loose and open-ended topic, something that kind of grounds the conversation and gives us a starting point, we could still get all of the great benefits of letting ideas flow, and build on the ideas of others, and give and receive feedback. And that was the way in which we evolved this very important behavior of dining together from a in-person environment to a virtual environment. So again, the behavior was a Zoom lunch. The outcome was still having the casual collisions and the ability to bounce ideas and get feedback. And we took the blockers, which was being able to speak one by one and just having no agenda, and we fixed those by having a little bit of structure.
Loose.
Loose structure.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that, Dinesh.
Yeah.
We understand that we've run through this relatively quickly. As we've said a couple of times, it's a relatively straightforward tool. It's pretty powerful, like most well-designed kind of flexible canvases like this. It can be used in a lot of different settings. And so what I'd like to do now that we've kind of gone through what we have to say, I'd like to know if you have any questions. If there's something that you're experiencing, or that you have a question about how you might set this up in an organization with your team, or you might suggest it to a team, how you might do that. So if there are any people that have some questions, let's open. If you'll go to the bar, the Zoom bar, there should be a thing saying, yeah, someone has found it. It should be a Q&A button. Hit that and it'll open a Q&A button on your screen, and you can see who has asked some questions, and we'll start to take these right now. You'll also see that there's a thumbs up sign at the bottom of each of the questions. So if you see a question here that you think, yeah, I want to know the answer to that too, just hit the thumbs up sign, so that we'll see, like, okay, there's more people who might want to know something about this. In this particular case, I'm going to try to talk to the first question first, Paulette's question around how do school leaders shift culture as they now lead in a virtual setting? This is really hard. I mean, this is a really difficult question. I'm sort of shocked that I'm starting with the most difficult question we could possibly answer, because, you know, as you know, a school environment is so very different than a typical organization like the one that I work in, because depending on the school, depending on its size, depending on what level in the educational system it is, there's a lot of distribution of people. Not only the students are in a number of different places, but the teachers themselves are in a number of different places. In very large schools and universities, there's going to be, you know, many layers of how things get done, right? The teachers themselves have a lot of flexibility about how to design what happens in their classroom, what outcomes they want to find or sort of generate from their students, and then figuring out then how to administer all of this work. It is, I think, what becomes really challenging in a school culture. Go ahead.
No, I can build on that a little bit, Greg. And I think one of the keys is, again, regardless of what organization you're working with, it's really thinking about what is that behavior that you've seen and you want that and you want it to shift. So what is the behavior that you see today, and what do you wish that behavior to be? And if you can do that and start that on the culture map, then you go up to the outcomes and the enablers and blockers, and hopefully it can help you understand how you can evolve that behavior. And then you do that a couple of more times until you start to see how you can evolve that.
Yeah, the last thing I would say on the school question is, this particular situation you're just talking about, that we're talking about, seems like it rely very, very heavily on communication, on very direct, very transparent between administration and faculty. Sometimes that can be extraordinarily difficult in administrative faculty relationships, because of the fact faculty have so much freedom to design their courses the way that they see fit. So, so a grounding of very open and transparent engagement, I think, is going to be critical to how to make that work better. I hope that answered some questions. There are several more that are coming up right now. bet several people have asked around what's the best way to facilitate this exercise in a virtual environment. It's a great question, and it's actually how I built this presentation. And I use that tool. I'm just going to make a suggestion about a tool to use. It's one, like I said a little while ago, that we use often and explain. It's called Mural. You can find it at mural.co. It's essentially, and there are several similar services. So Mural's not the only one. It's the one that we're most familiar with, and we find the most flexible for the work that we do. And what you can do is you can actually create essentially an online whiteboard. You can mimic the experience of being in a large room with somebody, and you can literally facilitating a meeting like on the walls. You can take this canvas, for example, and you can import it directly onto the mural, and then you can kind of lock it down to where it's stable. And this particular service allows you to create digital sticky notes that you can create and move. And so you can open it to the entire group. For example, let's just assume I'm doing this with you. There's a number of us who are here on a call, we're working together. And I'm asking, I give everybody a link to the mural, to the mural, the whiteboard. And I ask them to all to go there and to add their own sticky notes to the page. And we can give them like 5 minutes at a time to do this. And so that can happen relatively quickly. And then we can use each of these sections. Let's start with the behaviors, then go to the outcomes. Start with the behaviors, have people put in their own sticky notes around here, and then stop and do a little bit of affinity mapping around what are the themes we see coming up out of that. And literally making it an open conversation, a co-created conversation with everybody on the team. And I would really, that depends on some willingness to facilitate conversations. Not everybody really loves to do that. I happen to like to, which is why I get to do the job that I do. So, that helps sometimes. But the thing that I would stress in that little scenario that I painted is the co-creation part. Because if you're trying to see what a particular culture looks like or what the outcomes are or what might sort of enable behavior in that, you can't have that from just purely one point of view. You have to see, because different parts of an organization appear to different people within that organization. So if you can get a team of, let's call it 10 people together, hopefully they're from different departments within an organization, that they literally have different views on how the culture works. That's a good way to share that information in a mural like setting. You can make some progress pretty quickly. So let's go to one of the next ones here. What are some, we'd like to answer this question live. What are some techniques for gathering the behaviors, outcomes, and neighborhoods, especially for very large organizations? Okay, that's a very good question. And it's going to depend on being able to break this up into pieces and kind of chunk this out. If you're working with a smaller team, kind of the situation I was just describing, we can actually have that on a mural or on a wall if this is in a couple of months and we can meet together again. We can have a small team and tackle this entire thing one at a time. With a giant organization like this, it's relatively distributed, what I would suggest would be to break it into parts and give some time limits to each of those parts. Like, for example, and this might, let's say we'll stretch this over a couple of weeks. At the beginning, we can explain, this is the goal here, is to try to map out how our culture operates throughout the organization. And then have week one work purely on the behaviors. And we can set up perhaps sort of people who lead different parts of that organization can send out information to their teams, their distributed teams, where they're asking for input. It's like, what do you think some of the behaviors you see? This could be through a survey tool. This could be something that could be something as simple as a Google sheet that you send everybody to that they can fill things in on, whatever. But you give some time, their own time. Let's use a couple of days. If the organization's that big, they're going to be in many different time zones. And they're going to have many different calendars to navigate. So give them some time to do that, but don't make it forever. Let's make it 3 days, 5 days.
Yeah.
Do that for those sections.
So, Greg, building off of what you said, we actually had tackled this once in one of our client projects where we were dealing with an organization that was even bigger than 30,000 people, spread over multiple geographies. And we use a survey-based tool to send out to to all of the employees with very well-crafted questions. And then we had representatives from from different parts of the organization. In our case, we did it by business unit. And so the representative of each business unit was the one that would kind of synthesize the results that came in from their business unit. And then we had a smaller group of, I think, about 10 people that came to the facilitated meeting where we actually did the culture mapping.
Okay, yeah. So perfect finish to that. I hope that answered that question. Let me take this next one at the top here. How do you create a trustful virtual meeting where people are open to talk about real cultural challenges? This gets at the crux of what makes this either a successful or an unsuccessful exercise. And it's that word trust. I can't stress this enough. My guess is that there are a lot of people who are on the webinar right now who understand that they can't have conversations like this in their own organizations because they don't trust what's going to happen to me if I actually say something. And B, they don't necessarily trust who I'm saying this to because I don't know how they're going to react, right? Because that's a unfortunately, relatively common scenario in a lot of organizations. So the ways that we create trust, this is sort of I think this is like the issue of our time in organizations, is creating trust within organizations. And I think that it has to start, I'm going to sound like a broken record because I feel like I've said this already. I feel like it has to start with communication. And not only that, but I feel like it has to start with an openness and a transparency and a willingness, dare I say, a willingness to be vulnerable. And trying to set that expectation with the people that you're having the conversations with. I think that you can set that out not only in, for example, let's say we're going to take on a project where we need to have a meeting where people really need to talk about culture like this. When you're setting that up and you're inviting people to it, you're obviously telling them, this is what we're going to be doing at this meeting. But I think it's also worth trying to spend some time crafting a little bit of language that says, and furthermore, this is how we really want you to show up for this meeting. We're going to be talking about some things that not everybody is comfortable talking about all the time. And there's not going to be any judgment about this, but what we're trying to understand is what your experience is. It's not what you think someone else's experience is or what you want somebody else's experience to be, but we want you to be able to share your own experience without judgment. And we can say, but whoever says that has to be willing to say, I will not judge you for sharing this, okay? So how you put that forward, how you set up the conversation has everything to do with how people are going to trust you into entering into it. Okay, let's go to the next here. Identifying behaviors from Suzanne. Identifying behavior sounds like a bit like entering a minefield. Yeah, fair enough. How to set a space where people don't just get defensive. Again, it's another great question. And I feel like it's kind of related to what we were just talking about, or at least I would think about addressing it very similarly to how I just talked about. When people get defensive, it's because they either don't feel that there's trust, or they're in a place where they have been asked to do something but not necessarily given enough clarity around what their role is and what their how they actually fulfill that role. There's not enough clarity there to where they have to make some of their own decisions that they don't necessarily run by anybody else. They're like, I guess this is how I'm going to have to do this. And if suddenly they feel like they're getting called on the carpet for it, they're like, well, wait a minute. Nobody told me how to do this. I'm just doing the best I can. I'm just trying to figure this out myself. I can easily see how that's going to happen. Yeah. So I think one of the keys around that could be just being as clear as possible at the beginning around the non-judgmental part of having the conversation. Danush?
Yeah. So I think agree with everything you said, Greg. And I think another technique that we often use when we're trying to get people in a generative space is framing good questions, right? So we frame a good open-ended question, and then the person that's leading this effort or leading this session starts to model that vulnerability and starts to throw out the first few ideas and sets the ground rules that there's no bad ideas here, right? And we're going to build on each other's ideas. Nobody's going to shoot down anyone's ideas. There's no bad ideas. They're all ideas. That generally sets the stage for a generative conversation where people are focused on the question, focused on solving the problem, and it takes the the the, the personal liability out.
Okay, let me take Wendy's question here. What are your thoughts on implementing this type of cultural change in an industry that tends to have staff tend to be very unaware of their own behavior? And tend not to see the value. Oh, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. So I think there's a couple of things that spring immediately to mind, especially using this particular canvas as a way to have that conversation. If you can ground, especially if the group that you pull together, let's just say, for an example, you have a group of 15 people. It could be, well, you could be talking about, it could be much larger, but for illustration's sake, let's say we have a relatively small group of 15 people, and they work in different parts of an organization, and there may be a couple of people who are sort of, they're kind of rogues. They will go off and do their own thing. And they may think that since they've never been sort of pulled back from that, and they give some results around what they're supposed to be bringing into an organization, they may think that's fine, I'm just gonna go. But to your point, I think that, you know, perhaps we could have a scenario where they don't recognize how they're creating swirl or additional work, or even just flat out problems for other people in the organization. They're not seeing how the corollaries, they're not seeing how they connect to other people's work. Being able to address these behaviors, have focused on the behavior part, and have people put up behaviors that they witness, and then stopping and having a conversation around. So tell us a little bit about, you know, where you might see these things. And I don't mean to say like, well, Joe in sales does this. That's not exactly how I mean it. What I mean it is if we can be able to articulate and share the experiences that we're having, and then perhaps ask the question, who else sees this kind of behavior going on? And if it's corroborated by more than one person, quickly some people are going to be able to see like, okay, so something's happening in this organization that maybe I wasn't aware of, right? That's a beginning piece. And then I think the next part of that question would be like, do any of us feel like there's a role that we might play in this kind of behavior? And if so, you don't need to bring it up here, but I want you to recognize that and think about that as we start to think about the outcomes of our behaviors. So just setting up the conversations in that way and moving them forward, and letting people share their observations, share their experience, and getting them to validate with other people in the room, I think is the first step to that. I suspect that this is a knottier question that we would be happy to talk about in a different setting at length, if that would be helpful. I think that's about all the time I have time for at the moment. The next question, how do you consolidate and embed the good behaviors emerging when everyone is back in the office? Such a question. Go ahead, Danush.
So I think one of the tools that we use to, you know, when something good is happening to build momentum around that is storytelling, right? I think storytelling is a really important vehicle because it kind of hits at the primal parts of our brains, right? The stories are things that we have gravitated to since we were children, and that's how things stick. So if you craft a really good, compelling story around the behavior, even maybe celebrate the individual that's exhibiting that, or the team that's exhibiting that behavior, and if that kind of cascades out from leadership, whether that's in it's part of a talk or a presentation, or it's something that's like sent out in a weekly employee newsletter or anything like that. Those kinds of stories are the kinds of stories that start to build momentum, and then other people start to understand, oh, these are the behaviors that the organization wants to see, or we as the collective want to see happen, and that's how it starts to gain some traction. Over to you, Greg, for building on that.
Yeah. Well, actually don't have much to build on at all. I think that that's a perfectly great way to talk about that particular situation. We're running sort of close to the end of our time here. I want to answer Javier's question here, see if we can take that one. How to engage board members or directors in this, and with what priority should we give them in the process? I think this is a really great a great question. I'm guessing the way that you said, well, you could take this either from a private company that has a board of directors, or this could be a nonprofit organization. In either case, I think that it's really important. So there's a couple of different ways to think about this. Often directors are removed enough from the day-to-day culture of an organization that they literally just, they have no frame of reference for understanding the in and out of a culture. That's not I don't mean to say that that's 100% true, but it's often true. The work that they do is so disconnected from the day-to-day work that they may not necessarily have any view into the culture. So I would say that the way to bring this conversation to a board has more to do with the outcomes part of what comes on this particular canvas, because often, as we know, boards, directors, what they're focusing on quite a lot are what are those outcomes? What are the results of our work? Where are we going? How can we, what are we seeing? What are our, in a for-profit scenario, what kind of profits are we seeing? A number of other milestones that they may be paying attention to. And so if you can begin this conversation with them saying, we're seeing a change in the outcomes that we know that you are interested in measuring. So we have done some work to talk about what do we think is bringing about those. Now, sometimes there are very specific business reasons, for example, a global pandemic, that really have nothing to do with a culture creating those outcomes. But if you do have the time and can have a conversation at a staff level around what are we, having a conversation around the behaviors that create those outcomes, then you can go back to the board and say, this is why I think these outcomes are happening. This is what we're hearing in our organization, and we want to sort of talk with you around things we may be able to do to fix that or address that. If not fix it, at least address it. I hope that was a quick enough answer. We're very close to the end here, so I'm gonna stop our questions now. Thank you so much for all of the questions. These are great questions, and if there's some more that we can provide for you, by all means, please get in touch. We'd be happy to talk through any of these things if we can. I know that these aren't necessarily easy things to figure out in organizations. So hopefully this discussion and this tool can be a helpful way to think about how you can frame that discussion or frame that internal project, as it were. Erica, do you want to close out?
Sure, happy to. So thank you everybody for attending. Just as I mentioned earlier with the housekeeping notes, a copy of the recording, the slides, and a copy of the tool will be sent in an email in just a couple of business days. Greg, can you actually go back to the last slide?
Sorry, that sort of went sideways on me.
No problem. So for anybody that is interested, we are hosting another culture-related webinar on Tuesday, May 12th. And that's going to be the future of work, growing a virtual culture. And that will be led by our senior consultant, Elizabeth Hinckley. If you want to learn more about culture and any tools that we have, we encourage you to visit explain.com. We also have a number of culture-related card decks available at our store, which you can access via that URL there. And as Greg mentioned earlier, we love feedback and ideas. If you have questions or comments for us, feel free to reach out via email. And with that, thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of your Fridays.
All right. Be well, everyone. Thank you.